Hello everyone and welcome to the Constructive Criticism Network. This network is here to help you improve at Magic the Gathering at every level. From Pauper Leagues to Top 1000 Mythic, we've got you covered. If you want to hear the entire network, head on over to our sponsor at PureMTGO.com, where you can hear each and every show, each and every week, and check out their sponsor, MTGO Traders, and tell them that the CCMTG Network sent you. Now sit back, enjoy the show. From YouTube, podcasts, and more, here's this week's episode from ConstructiveCriticism.com.
Hello everyone, welcome to the 345th episode of Constructed Criticism. I'm your host Mason and I'm joined by a special guest host. Harlan Firer from Team Nova. Harlan, how you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm happy to be on the cast. 345 episods. That is quite a few.
That is what Drake said back when he guested around episode 300. So
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So, CC's been around for a while. It's always kind of funny when the number gets said out loud. It's kind of like, wow, that is a lot of episodes. We talked a lot about Magic here, for sure.
Yes, a storied cast, if you will.
For sure. Well, Harlan, you're stepping in this week because Allie had surgery, as some of you might have seen on social media, so she can't do anything. But y'all are doing a podcast that at this rate's going to hit 300 episodes in about a week, since you do 2 per week here. What podcast do you do, and how might people find you and that sort of stuff before we hop into the episode?
Yeah, I do a podcast called Up to Date MTG. It's with a 2, not a TO. I do that twice a week with Zach Allen. We basically try and keep everyone up to date on mostly standard, but we also touch on modern and some pioneer. And we basically do a lot of metagame analysis, keeping people... We do some level up episodes every now and then. But yeah, you can find us on really any streaming platform under that name, and our Twitter is the same @.
Yep. Yeah, so every week they kind of do, when we do like these standard breakdown episodes, they're got this really cool thing where they, you record your first episode like on a Monday or a Tuesday, and it drops the next day, and then the last episode drops like the Friday before an event. So you kind of get to see how metagames evolve. So often in Magic content, things age out as soon as we put them out, and by having the second podcast to follow it up, it really does let you get better feedback to the listeners about, like, we had these thoughts, we had this stuff, and then boom, here it is in action. We were right, we're here, we're wrong. So
yeah, exactly. We each listen to a lot of podcasts, and it's kind of weird how we'll record on like Tuesday and the episode comes out on Friday. They're almost behind by the time the episode comes out. And so what we do is we record every Monday night and Thursday night, and every episode comes out every Tuesday and Friday.
Perfect. Yeah. So really say something on it. And originally, y'all, before COVID, we're going to do 3 episodes a week. So I can't wait to see what your work schedule is like when COVID's over and you're doing 3 a week. That's going to be something else. Y'all will easily surpass us at that point when it comes to episodes.
Yeah, 3 a week. It was fun. It's really challenging to come up with that much content with the reduced number of events during COVID. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I'm really excited for when we actually do get to return to Paper Magic at some point in the future. That, yeah, we'll get to crank that number back up to 3 a week, and we'll have one every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for everyone.
Yeah, that's going to be exciting. I'm very excited to see how that all plays out. It's going to be fun. But we have to get into the point of the show, Harlan, that's always improving. Here at CC, we're always trying to get better and stride towards, improving at Magic. We're just life in general. And so I guess I'll take the lead since you're the guest this week. Normally you let guests go first, but not here at CC. We're very narcissistic. My always improving moment this week is something I've been trying to work on recently, which is slowing down when I play. I find that even though a lot of the times my play doesn't change by taking that extra half beat to think about the play or make sure nothing's changed, it's very helpful. And in the moments when it does save me, like where I realize my play might be wrong, that's normally like a game-ending mistake I was about to make. This past weekend in the Arena Qualifier, I almost snapped Mystical Disputed this Dance Demands because I'd thought about that for so long, and I realized, I shouldn't do this because I have a Wrath in my hand that I drew on the turn before, so I should actually just save this dispute. I can just clear the board, and they'll get to draw a couple cards off their omens. And that sort of play is like, a huge thing, and I've been really trying to work on slowing down so that isn't such a problem as it can be, sometimes if you're playing super quickly.
Yeah, no, I
problem as it can be, sometimes if you're playing super quickly.
Yeah, no, I did a similar thing years ago where I really tried to internalize that in myself, like, hey, I really need to slow down. And yeah, it's a really big issue in a lot of people's games that they may or may not notice. It's really easy to catch it kind of like immediately after it happens, but it's really hard to kind of have it in your mind before you do it. And that was something I worked on personally before. And one of the things I've been working on for me now is trying to gain additional perspectives of a game, right? So everyone thinks about Magic differently and approaches it differently. And it's not about being right. It's about like you want to win, right? And your way isn't always the best way to do that. And so what I've been trying to do is kind of gain insights from other people, how they would approach situations or game, kind of take that into account and kind of add that to my repertoire of how I could approach those situations. And then I can use all of those options at my disposal to choose what is best for me in that case, instead of just kind of having my more narrow focus of how I normally play. And that's been something I've been working on recently, and I've definitely been seeing results almost immediately.
Yeah, I think that's super helpful. That was one of the things that when I first started playing Magic competitively was talking with my friends and the way they would see things. I found gave me that insight like you talked about, but also it helped me reason things out. Like, how many times have you made like your opponents need to play and you're like, why would they do that? And it's just like, oh, I remember like I had a conversation like this. This might be the reason, or something along that line. How to get you in their head and how they're thinking, and that can be super helpful in the games.
Yeah, that's actually like a little tiny bonus one we can throw in is that if you're ever playing against somebody and they make a play that makes no sense to you, they made an oopsie poopsie, as Mason likes to say. They had a reason. They wanted to do that thing. So why did they want to do it that way? You can actually gain a lot of information from the way they did it, even if it's something you don't really understand. You just have to think through it, and you can gain information about what's in their hand, maybe what they're playing towards, and don't just write it off as a mistake. Sometimes it is a mistake, but the extra thinking doesn't really cost you. If they made a mistake anyway, you're ahead, right? They just made a mistake. But if they didn't make a mistake and they are trying to play towards something, you can figure that out and gain an advantage there.
For sure. One of my favorite quotes that's come out of quarantine is Lee from Grindcast. He was talked about how at a paper event, I'm across from my opponent, they make a play that doesn't make sense. I spend a minute thinking about what is the reasoning. Clearly they have an idea, and I'm on arena and they do the same thing. I'm like, lol, idiot, and I just attack. And so, you can gain a lot of advantage just by thinking, right? I spend a minute thinking about what is the reasoning. Clearly they have an idea, and I'm on arena and they do the same thing. I'm like, lol, idiot, and I just attack. And so, you can gain a lot of advantage just by thinking, right? Like, your opponent is a person, and they have, thoughts and ideas and reasons, and they might not be optimal, and they might have made a mistake, but like Harlan said, if they made a mistake, gas, and if they're trying to like lure you into a situation or do something that maybe you weren't expecting, then this could be super helpful for you, and you're becoming the one who's not thinking if you're not like wondering why my opponent bolted their own creature or whatever. So
yeah, exactly. It's what I like to refer to as baited and outsmarted. You give up a little bit to like show some weakness, and they like pounce on it, and then it's like, haha, I got you. That was my plan all along.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that was a great Always Improving segment. Let's move on to our Patreon question. If you want to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/ccmtg. And one of the perks of being a patron of the show is you get to ask questions like this one for events. And obviously this is something that's, kind of awkward where like there have been moments during quarantine, at least for myself, I don't know about you, Harlan, where I haven't really participated in tournaments that much. And I've had to get battle ready again, I guess, for lack of a better word. But we both played the online pro tour. So Harlan, what was one of the ways that, you stay sharp for these sort of events online? Because they are like, I don't know about you, for me, it's hard to say really aware for them.
Yeah. So for me, normally, if I was preparing for paper events, my usual process was take past information I had from previous paper events of the same format, right? That was basically my testing, was the actual previous event. And that's where I would draw most of my information and conclusions from. And then to kind of stay up on what everyone else was doing, I would take in content, read articles, watch streams, talk to other people about how their playtesting and such went. But now in quarantine, I typically don't have those past events to draw information from. So it actually ends up being me playing a lot more. And I think it's actually a worse process for me, the way I work. I've felt less prepared when I go into an event because I'm kind of more tunneled on, I would say, overall lower quality testing, because my testing is mostly focused on arena ladder or MTGO leagues. And then I still try to work a lot with people that are playing games themselves, try and watch some content. The content's a little fewer and further between now. And there's not as many people working on the same event as you are, because there's less people kind of focused on events right now. And so my personal process has been really hampered by this. And it's been actually something for me to try and overcome during these times. Something for me to try and overcome during these times.
Yeah, I feel very similar to that. It's very hard to do what I like to do, which is kind of a similar process. A lot of like looking at past events, thinking about what's going on when it comes to like the content and the format and what people are talking about the format. I find like the narrative of the format can really shed a lot of insight and light onto like what you're supposed to be doing. Like if everyone thinks the format's about Urza, then like that can really affect what other people are going to do, and you can kind of start to think about how you want to build a sideboard and stuff like that. It's like a good starting place. And like you said, it's just not the case right now, and maybe some people take the events differently because they don't think of it as serious, or whatever reason. A lot has shifted, and so I agree, it's awkward and hard. And I think, just to be honest, one of the weirder things about this is that we've all started using ladder and leagues to really test more, right? And the people we're talking with are doing the same thing, but there's been a lot less like focused testing on matchups and talk, right? And the people we're talking with are doing the same thing, but there's been a lot less like focused testing on matchups and talking, where before that was the thing that I felt like was done more, or at least I participated more in when there were real events. And it seems like the gains would be bigger if you did that stuff now, since no one's really doing it. But we don't do it. We just play ladder and we talk to each other, even though like in some cases, like the Mana Trader series, the prize pool is bigger than, like the EV is way higher than any open and most invitationals, so it's very interesting how so much has changed. But yeah, it's been hard to stay sharp, I would say. And one of the things I've been trying to do is just kind of constantly question what I think and listen to what others think and try to establish the best basis I can.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I've personally been trying to do. It is just so hard. I would say I'm certainly not sharp. I'm not really rusty either. I'm more just kind of dull kind of right now. It I normally have in games, where typically when I'm playing a paper event and I'm playing my deck, I feel like I know the matchup better than my opponent. And I just never have that feeling anymore. No matter how much I play, I don't feel like, even if I have the repetition, I don't have the depth of knowledge that I used to.
Do you feel like that's a confidence thing more so than an actual thing? Does that make sense? Like, do you feel like maybe when you were playing the events, you felt more confident in the seat in the moment? Because I know that I felt that way with certain decks.
It might be that. I think it probably stems from the difference to me mentally from paper to online Magic, where I can't really like put myself into it the same way I do with paper. Like I can really, when I'm playing a paper match, I can really enter like the zone where I just have that like killer mentality. Everything else is pushed out. Where in Magic, I never feel plugged in like that. Even if I have everything pushed out, it doesn't like click the same way. And I think that's probably a large part of it. I think another big part of it is that I don't ever kind of get to that point where I have that, I guess, level of confidence, like you mentioned, for the first event. So when I'm trying to pull that information again later, I didn't have that rock to pull from. I'm kind of pulling from information I'm not super confident about. So I never have like a strong base to build from.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I feel that for sure. The more I talk about this, the more I wonder, because I feel kind of similar, like when you mentioned like you don't have the confidence that you know the matchup. I wonder how much of it is just us like growing up and competing in like paper events and that being like the environment, and now that we're in a new one, we just kind of feel out of place, because I I wonder how much of it is just us like growing up and competing in like paper events and that being like the environment. And now that we're in a new one, we just kind of feel out of place, because I felt confident in stuff like that at the Pro Tour, weirdly, of all places. Like when we played the online Players Tour, I felt that way. But I did in other stuff, and I wonder if that's because maybe I took it more seriously, where I was...
Same way about the the Players Tour. And I never actually felt like I was plugged in the same way, but I did have that confidence in my deck. Like I registered a day early. I had played, I don't know.
Did you register a day early?
I tried to register.
Okay, I was just curious.
Registering a few hours late. Always make sure you click the submit button. That's a key life lesson in these online Magic times. Make sure you actually are submitted.
They say you can't get a deck reg error, but Harlan found a way.
Oh, I found a way. Yeah, so I had played just an insane number of matches with my deck. It was the deck that I kind of built and pioneered for that event anyway, that developed as an archetype. And I did have that confidence in the games, but I still wasn't plugged in. And I think that is just kind of this starting core of a deck that I basically built, which is already a hard thing for me to do because I'm not much of an actual deck builder myself. And then I had, I don't know, 200 or 300 matches played with the deck for me to have that confidence. And that is nearly impossible to replicate again in these times. Just even with extra free time, like you don't have that much.
For sure, yeah. And especially with this stand, with how much things are shifting, it's so hard. You know, at least with that one, it was like, okay, you have to beat Reclamation, figure it out. So yeah, it's definitely hard for sure. Well, hopefully this brought some insight to the question. I know that it's kind of awkward, but we're working with it too, and it's something that, you know, hopefully in the dream world we wouldn't have to figure it out for too much longer, you know, but hopefully as things go along, we do kind of improve at that process in general. Maybe this is one that in the future, you know, we can actually do like a whole episode on once we kind of get a firmer grip on it ourselves. The other way to support the show besides being a patron is you can go to Oasis Games. This is one that in the future, you know, we can actually do like a whole episode on once we kind of get a firmer grip on it ourselves. The other way to support the show besides being a patron is you can go to Oasis Games and you can use code CCMTG to get 4% off your every order, and you can use code Would That Be Good to get 15% off your first order. Harlan, you could go and you could pick up Urza cards, which is funny, by the way, earlier when you said you don't build decks. I feel like a lot of people know you as the Urza guy. You built Urza. You're the Urza man, you know? And you could go pick up those cards now, and then maybe when they as a thank you gift for, you know, getting through COVID, you'd be able to play Urza again. Wouldn't that be exciting?
That would be exciting. I don't think it's going to happen, and B, still have all of my Urza cards, unfortunately.
Ooh, you didn't get to the Opals in time?
I still have the Opals and the Okos. I even have 8 Okos because I'm a big dingus, you know?
I have my Okos. I actually have them right over here. I felt like it was that weekend in Knoxville, and there was like everyone was sure it was going to get banned the next day. And I lost faith in WotC for one day, and I was like, I don't think they're going to do it. I think they're going to ride it out till the next set. I think I'm going to need these for, like, you know, the next event. And I was wrong. I was happy to be wrong, but I am a little bit poorer for it. So
yeah, you should have known that I was just a big dummy and would have had 8, and then you could have just borrowed my extra 4 every event.
I should have known that. And honestly, that's on me. And now going forward, I'll make sure not to buy cards unless it's for the amazing deal from Oasis Games. So thank you once again, Oasis Games. Really talk about Modern much on the show recently. It's been so standard and historic focused with everything going on. And, you know, Allie and I just don't have as much time to play Modern as we did before. You know, Allie streams predominantly historic and standard. And so with you coming on the show and up to date pioneering Modern with 2 different decks we're going to talk about today, y'all kind of, I mean, I think it's fair to say, paved the way and kind of started a discussion on. It felt like the perfect time to talk about Modern and have you on. So, Harlan, what do you think about Modern right now before we really kind of hop into the decks we decided to talk about today?
It's not my most favorite Modern format I've ever played. I'm definitely very much a Modern enthusiast. Just that has always been, ever since Modern came out, it's been a format I've loved. It's been the format I've tried to play the most. This format is great. It's not my favorite, but it is actually an excellent, pretty well-balanced format, I think.
Yeah, I think weirdly my favorite Modern format might have been the one before this with like also weirdly the Oka Urza Stoneblade times. Like I feel like you could actually play unfair decks and win. the fair decks were somehow like the best deck, but like they felt beatable. So like even though it was kind of annoying to play against them, like I don't know, it just felt like the two perfect eras. And right now it's kind of like a soupied up version of that, I would say. It's kind of a bunch of just bluish decks doing things. But
yeah, so I personally, in just formats in general, not even just Modern, I really like it when there's one deck that is slightly better than everything else. Not oppressively better, because that's just no fun. But when there's one deck that is clearly just a little tiny cut above the rest, you get the best metagames for how I like to play Magic, and for me personally, I think just in general are the best metagames, because you have kind of a clear target for everyone to start with, and then you have a metagame developed around that deck, and I think that is what really creates like the best for me. And right now we kind of don't have that. We have a bunch of decks that are pretty even on power level across, and the rock paper scissors meta to me is not quite as exciting.
yeah, I actually think I agree with that statement a lot. I do like it when there's something that's kind of like the target and it's just a little bit better. I feel like one of the problems people have with Modern is like they felt like anything could happen to them. They didn't have the sideboard slots, and like they didn't have the answers to like even answer stuff if they wanted to. And we've gotten some more powerful cards since that time, but I agree. Like when it feels like anything could happen to you, and there's like no clear best deck or anything like that, you can kind of get lost in the weeds a little bit, and then it just becomes not fun because you show up, you kind of thought you understood what's going on, and then it's like red black prowess was the best deck, idiot, and you're like, I didn't even know that was a thing. And so I agree. It's like it can be very hard. I think especially when I talk to people who play Modern more casually, it's like every now and again, or if an event comes up, that definitely happens. Talk to people who play Modern more casually, it's like every now and again, or if an event comes up, that definitely happens, where they're like, I don't know, like I'm just gonna get troned, or I'm gonna get boggled, or just something like that's gonna happen to me. And if there's something like Urza, even though they might not like playing against Urza, they at least know, okay, I'm gonna battle against Urza, I'm gonna bring my Stony Silences and my Disdainful Strokes and my Mystical Disputes, and I'm ready to go.
Yeah, exactly. You can kind of have a plan going in, where right now you have to just, I don't know, throw a bunch of darts at the wall.
You kind of have to hedge a bunch. I've played a lot of these Omnath soup decks, which we're about to hop into here, and all of the sideboards are like, all right, you got like 7 2-ofs and a 1-of. Maybe you got a 3-of instead of a 2-of, but like that's kind of the thing, and you kind of bring in a couple cards and mix and mash to make it happen. And so, I kind of mentioned the name already, Omnath soup decks. Harlan, what are these Omnath soup decks? Is that card actually Modern playable? Like, I know it kind of killed Standard, but is it good enough?
Yeah, I mean, the card
Standard, but is it good enough?
Yeah, I mean, the card has legs. It is truly, truly good enough. It's funny, we had kind of a running joke on Up to Date that Goldfish had given up before Omnath got printed, and they had just started lumping all the Uro decks together in one category called Uro piles. And then Omnath got printed, and they looked so smart because then they actually were just all Omnath decks anyway, and they already had everything compiled into one place. But yeah, Omnath, sorry, is the real deal. It is just another busted mythic for these blue soup decks to play. It gets pitched to Force of Negation when you have multiples. You can brainstorm it the extras away with Jace. They're incentivized to kill it anyway. It puts you up a card, so having a backup's usually pretty good. It just has a very powerful effect, and it can put you ahead in a game that you were a little bit behind very quickly and can snowball you. And yeah, I mean,
wild. Right? When I first saw these like Omnath soupy decks, which by the way, when we say soup, we kind of just mean like pile of good-ish cards, like Path and Bolt and like a Cryptic Command, like that kind of stuff. Uro, just things that are good in that color. When I first saw these decks, I was like, well, like these things are like kind of good, and we've seen like Bant Uro be a pretty good thing in the past, but like the mana is probably too wide, and like aggressive decks get under them. But Uro and Omnath really do just kind of stop any like linear aggressive deck from actually killing you most of the time when you combine it with all those like weird answers you have, and just cards that like trade for a card. And it's oddly impressive. It's not something that like if I hadn't played it or seen it get played, I wouldn't believe right off the bat, Yeah,
no, it's incredible. I think the biggest thing that people are missing with the Omnath decks currently is something to make sense. So we kind of started with we took the Uro kind of Bant Field of the Dead deck, and we just put a couple red sources and Omnath into it because it fits pretty naturally, right? You're already trying to play multiple lands in a turn. It's really castable, even though you're already a 3-color deck with a bunch of colorless lands. And you had a couple things to use the mana. You had Hour of Promise and occasionally a Teferi Hero of Dominaria as kind of like payoffs for the mana. And to me, that always just was like a little confusing, right? Like you have this powerful card, but you're not using the most powerful aspect of it very well, which is the mana production to me, right? That is what makes the card busted, is it's quote unquote free the turn you play it. It's just a 0 mana 4/4 that draws a card and gains you 4 life. And then you get to do your busted 5-drop after. And nobody was really taking advantage of that. Zach and I came in and I was like, Zach, why aren't people just playing Time Warp after your Omnath? You just have a bunch of blue fetches in your deck anyway, because you're a Mystic Sanctuary deck. So you just go Omnath, draw your card, fetch land, crack it, get any blue land. You just have mana for Time Warp, and then you get to untap with your Omnath right away. That seems so busted to me, and nobody was doing it.
Yeah, I gotta admit, I heard them the episode, and I thought maybe Harlan's being a little cheeky on Time Warp. Like I thought Time Warp might have been a stand-in for something better. And then y'all kept talking, and I started thinking about it, and then it like hit me like, oh my goodness, like with Wrenn and 6 and Time Warp, like you actually just like, I think maybe you mentioned it like in a couple minutes in the show, it's like that wins the game. Like you kind of have a weird Splinter Twin situation where like if you have Omnath plus Time Warp, you start taking turns, and if you play like a Wrenn and 6 and you buy back a fetch land and you like put it on top and like keep going and going and going, you do just kind of play like a Wrenn and 6 and you buy back a fetch land and you like put it on top and like keep going and going and going, you do just kind of win the game. Like eventually your Wrenn ultimates, right? And so then you have infinite turns, or you just like kill them with like your Omnath or maybe like an Uro you played or something like that, and they just kind of die. And I've played the deck a little bit, and it's actually just kind of amazing. It's just like a really strong end game that your generic mid-range deck just kind of gets to play, which is surprising.
Yeah, and you're still a Force of Negation deck, so sometimes the Time Warps do just get pitched. Like, you actually are looking for just generic good blue cards to play these days, so that you have the quantity of blue cards you need to actually play Force of Negation in your deck. And then people always meme about the 5-mana Explorer, right? It's a deck that literally plays Growth Spiral anyway. Yeah. And you have multiple Planeswalkers in your deck. You have Wrenn and 6, Jace the Mind Sculptor, Teferi, Time Raveler. You well set up to be a Time Walk deck, and you're not really pushing it to being a taking turns deck. You just are a deck with 4 Time Warps, because Time Warp is honestly just busted with Omnath. It really is just the best thing I think you can do with 5 mana after your Omnath, because it just lets you untap with the Omnath and do it all again.
Yeah, I agree, and I really do think that the Wrenn and 6 plays like a huge role in this, where it does allow you to like loop it, like otherwise you're gonna need to like have a bunch of fetch lands in hand, but you kind of already want Wrenn and 6 because it's good against like most aggressive decks and just smooths your draw out, and you're playing a 4-color deck, and it having the ability to just honestly win the game, like eventually you just always have all the turns, is an incredibly powerful thing to do in Modern at a very low cost to your deck. Because like you said, you do want something when to play off Omnath. You want to have cards you can pitch the Force of Negation, and like the comboing matchups and stuff like that. But it isn't the powerful payoff, and it kind of just weirdly all fits perfectly together in this kind of like oddball looking shell, but honestly incredibly powerful when you play with it. And so that deck has kind of risen up.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that deck has kind of just risen up to be one of the 2 premier Omnath decks.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy because it's only like a week old at this point, that it kind of caught on very quickly, but everyone wants to try the meme, right? And then the meme is actually just winning a lot. Like, I haven't actually heard from anyone who's just gotten crushed while they play it. They've all had pretty good records for the most part. I've seen a lot of people have actual success with it. And yeah, it's easy to write it off as because it's just a Time Warp deck. But like you said, you just have to play the blue cards anyway, so you would just have more of these blue cards that aren't good in multiples in your deck. So you're just playing another powerful blue effect. And its downside is said that you just have to play the blue cards anyway, so you would just have more of these blue cards that aren't good in multiples in your deck. So you're just playing another powerful blue effect. And its downside is still you just get to untap again and draw another card. And you have Mystic Sanctuary in your deck. So anytime your opponent passes while behind on board, they're almost dead. If you have a Time Warp in your yard, you just fetch a Sanctuary end of turn and you just get 2 turns.
Yep.
We're basically free, right?
Yeah. Another thing I noticed when playing the deck is sometimes if your Uro just gets to attack a couple times, your opponent can't win, kind of regardless of the situation. Like, you're going to chump through enough of their creatures and draw enough cards, you're going to gain enough life they can't aggro you out. And Time Warp plus Uro is just like, weirdly draw a couple cards, gain some life, and a lot of times that's actually just good enough. You're like, oh, I just got to draw like 3 cards before they got to do anything else besides my card for turn, and now I'm gonna, like, I don't know, pass with this Cryptic up, and I'll just tap your stuff down and attack you again. Yeah, it's been very, very impressive. Now, there's the other Omnath deck that tries to combo off, and we saw Canister win the challenge with it, which feels like forever ago, 2 weeks ago now. That's Copycat playing Omnath. So, Harlan, what do you think about that? Because that's another deck that is using the bonus mana in kind of a different way to kind of win the game.
Yeah, I've always had a very low opinion of that deck. And the main reason why is it's not interactive. It does sometimes Goldfish to turn 3 kill, which is powerful. It's not very good at doing that because you have to have a Utopia Sprawl, a Saheeli Rai, and a Felidar Guardian. And mana to cast all of those, which is mostly trivial with the way mana bases are nowadays, but it's not irrelevant, right? So your deck does have some draws that are quick. A lot of times you kind of have to spin your wheels a little bit to find your combo pieces to actually kill your opponent. And in the meantime, 2 Remand and Renin 6, hoping that they have 1 toughness creatures, which, spoiler alert, there's not really 1 toughness creatures in the format because of Renin 6 and Lava Dart. So you're really just trying to interact with your opponent with 4 Path to Exiles and 2 Remands, and that's about it. This is modern. There are people playing no actual lands in their deck. Their deck is called Oops All Spells, and they kill you on turn 3. Like, what are we doing here?
Yeah, it's a little weird how the deck, it kind of feels like a lot of pieces of a deck that could be good, and they kind of just put cards in the deck to fill slots. Like the Remand slot to me really does feel weird. It's like, okay, cat decks in the past have played Remand because we need slots. Like the Remand slot to me really does feel weird. It's like, okay, cat decks in the past have played Remand because we needed it because we like didn't do anything on 2, but like the deck does stuff now and like it taps out way more, and it's just kind of like a weird situation of like, okay, Omnath's really good, free mana's really good, this shell was okay enough before we can, put it in the hands of Canister, we're going to win a bunch of games. We've got this, and hasn't really adapted with its kind of new version of itself, like it's a different deck now in a weird sort of way, or at least slants a different way. And yeah, it's interesting. I always thought those kind of decks were fun to play, but not the most powerful, and this sort of build kind of just goes a little bit too all over the place. I've seen a lot of people play it, and I've played a little with myself, and just wasn't quite as impressed as I was with like the generic like taking turns build of Omnath.
Yeah, and for me it all circles back to this is modern. You need to be able to interact. You don't necessarily back to this is modern. You need to be able to interact. You don't necessarily have to interact, but you have to be equipped to do so if you need to be doing that, right? And the cat deck, the way it has to be built for it to be as streamlined as possible, cannot do that. It does not have the blue count for Force of Negation. They sometimes play some in the sideboard, but even then you're having to leave in weird cards just to have a blue count to have Force of Negation in your deck. You can't really play counter spells because your deck is all sorcery speed clunkers, kind of. And you just end up not being able to interact with your opponent outside of the Path to Exiles or hoping that they're mostly a creature deck. And to me, that's just a non-starter in this format.
Yeah, I agree. I think that deck just kind of has to fundamentally change. I think we've spent a good bit of time kind of talking about Omnath Soup, which I think are like, the Europie success is Red Black Shadow. And Harlan, since we last talked about the deck, they've got another Death Shadow and Scourge of the Skyclave. So what do you think about this new Prowess deck?
I am a big fan of this deck. It's not really my style, so I don't really play with it very much. But I have been very impressed by basically Shadow being able to have effectively 2 copies of Shadow now with Scourge, and having the prowess threats in addition to your kind of late game in quotes, your mid game threats being Shadows and Scourges, having the early pressure of the prowess threats is awesome to me. Your deck can do a lot of things. Like now you can play 2 creature opponent if they're a little bit slower. If they're really fast, you can still be a Thoughtseize into a giant threat to TBR them to death. It gives you a lot of different avenues with how your games can play out, and that kind of squeezes your opponent because they have to be prepared for both ends, right? Like you can play Fatal Push, but what's your secondary removal, right? You can't really be playing Black-White to have Path. So are you going to play Lightning Bolt? Lightning Bolt's only good against half their creatures. And then, not to mention, you still just get to completely free roll Lurrus, which Lurrus isn't quite what it used to be, but it still is Lurrus, right? It still gives you this really strong mid to late game engine in your otherwise like hyper aggressive deck. I really like this deck. It can struggle quite a bit with these Path to Exile heavy Omnath decks sometimes because you don't have Stubborn Denial now that you're not playing blue to kind of fight through multiple removal spells or a sweeper like you used to be able to. You really have to pace your discard spells really well. And you also aren't really that equipped to burn your opponent out reach-wise. You really do have to get across the finish line with creatures. So in that regard, it can struggle a little bit, but for me, it's just a rock star of a deck.
Yeah, this is the other deck. Now, the rest of these decks I haven't played recently, but this is the other one I played a little bit, and I was very impressed. I always didn't really like the Grixis Shadow decks. I thought there's a lot of weird tension and mismatching, like disjointed draws happening, at times, and we're really hoping to draw the right half of your deck. And while your deck does lose things like Stubborn, you've really honed in on this, like, I'm going to discard you and attack you to death plan. And making your deck like a better TBR deck in a lot of ways by not only increasing your shadows, but just the way that like your cards interact with TBR between prowess creatures, or with Scourge because it's the highest life total. Sometimes you'll knock them down a little bit more and actually get bigger for the second hit. That leads to some weird like one hit kills that you wouldn't expect with that card. And I just found it to be very good, and it puts your opponent to a test very quickly. And one of the things I found is that if the Shadow player doesn't really have the discard early, the Omnath decks can just kind of like, they're normally like mulligan to have that sort of thing once they know it's the matchup, and they'll hold you back enough that they just generate enough extra cards and you die. And so the Shadow decks are surprisingly good as long as they have like a discard spell, which is kind of the place I want to be if I'm playing a Shadow deck, to be honest. I want my Thoughtseize draws to be really strong, and this deck kind of does that, and that's in big part thanks to Scourge of the Skyclave.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think the prowess threats actually help a lot there too, is because sometimes like you always want to have some kind of a threat to either preempt or follow up your Thoughtseize, right? And that's one thing that Grixis Shadow is to Thoughtseize your opponent, take their best card, slow them down a bit, and then actually sufficiently punish them. And this deck is extremely good at always having that pressure to go with that Thoughtseize. And that, to me, is what makes this deck so good.
Yeah, I agree. I wonder if you're supposed to, like, go towards Jund and play Goyf. Like, I wonder if, like, you're supposed to have even more, like, 1 into 2 draws.
So, I've seen those decks.
Okay.
The struggle there is when you start adding Goyf to the deck, Scourge kind of suffers, strangely, because it's hard to incorporate Goyf as a third color and a card into this prowess build, because you do have to maintain your kind of spell density for your prowess threats. And so if you're weakening your prowess threats, they might not be as high of a priority, so you actually might want to be more mid-rangey because you're slowing down a little bit then too, because your damage output isn't as high. But then, now that you've kind of made the prowess threats worse, and then might not be as high of a priority, so you actually might want to be more mid-rangey because you're slowing down a little bit then too, because your damage output isn't as high. But then, now that you've kind of made the prowess threats worse and then moved away from them, your Scourges are actually harder to turn on because
you can't get the early damage in.
Yeah, you're a worse burn deck and you have less early damage. So you're really just trying to go Thoughtseize, Tarmogoyf. Do I get to untap with it? Fingers crossed to hit you so that my Scourge can be turned on.
Yeah.
And that's where you get kind of shaky.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it doesn't quite play out. Also, just making your deck higher CMC is probably not the best thing when we're trying to be lean, mean fighting machines. All right, well, the
Yeah,
other...
exactly.
Sorry?
Go ahead.
No, I was going to segue away, but if you have...
If you do start moving towards Goyf, that's where you kind of want those stubborn denials back, because you do kind of have that third threat to enable them, and you're a little bit slower, so you do kind of have to play through your opponent's cards more instead of just under them. And then you kind of end up being even worse of a Scourge deck because you have another color that you have to manage, and you're even less aggressive because you now have a reactive card in your deck. I think that is a potential direction you could try to head to moving forward. I'm certainly not the person who's going to figure that out.
Yeah, me neither. That's not going to be me. But moving forward and figuring stuff out, let's kind of talk about what two of the decks that were bigger when we last talked about Modern here on CC, and that was Prowess and Humans. And let's start off with Prowess. Just before the last set, honestly, Prowess was one of the marquee decks of the format and one of the best aggressive decks. What's happened to Prowess in the last, 2 months?
It got in its deck. It's really what happened. It's kind of funny that the two of the marquee aggro decks in the format, Prowess and Shadow, just ended up merging with Scourge being printed because Scourge wanted you to be that aggressive deck, and it kind of brought Shadow back to the forefront of the format where it had kind of been falling off. And so Prowess as a deck, just like Mono Red or maybe one of the splashes, just can't really survive in a format where there are 8 Death Shadows in a lot of the decks, because your damage output ranges heavily on the creatures, and you're not really you're not a deck full of lava spikes. You aren't just burning them out. You are trying to front load a bunch of damage, and if your creatures do die, you have just enough burn to squeak across the finish line, which is not how you want to be playing against the Death Shadow deck. They are full of removal spells and beefy blockers. Do die, you have just enough burn to squeak across the finish line, which is not how you want to be playing against the Death Shadow deck. They are full of removal spells and beefy blockers, and they can turn the corner quick on you. That is a recipe for disaster against Prowess, or for Prowess.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Then the other decks in the format being Uro Omnath decks, it seems really hard to be so much in that angle and not have the big chunking hits that the Shadows provide. So let's talk about Humans then, because Humans does try to build these kind of bigger boards, and it traditionally was pretty good against Shadow decks. And we're talking about these Omnath decks being really reliant on Omnath and Uro, and they got Meddling Mage. Why isn't Humans playing a bigger role in things?
So Humans did come back. It has kind of been around. It's struggled a bit with the presence of Lava Dart in the Prowess decks, Ren and 6 in the Omnath decks, and because the Prowess decks are now a disaster for Humans, Humans still has Auriok Champion as a good plan post board and is just more of a player now. It's not really a top dog. It's not really pushed out of the metagame. It's just right in the thick of things now.
Awesome. Okay, so it's kind of like a fine deck to choose or whatever in Modern. It's just not like a marquee choice like it was maybe a year ago. I guess it'd be a little over a year ago now. That's kind of wild.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. I kind of alluded to this when we first started talking about Modern, is the format is very flat power level wise. Everything is just pretty good. Anything that is good is just very solid. The Omnath and the Shadow decks kind of have risen to the top. They're just, I think, more popular. I don't think they're necessarily that much better than anything else. I think it is just that they are more popular.
Sure. They are the kind of decks that people like to play, like the sweepy or the hyper lean. So yeah, that makes sense.
Exactly. All the fair blue players and kind of mid-rangey players are pulled to the Omnath decks. All players and kind of mid-rangey players are pulled to the Omnath decks. All of the Prowess players, all of the Shadow players, most of the Jund players are kind of pulled towards the red-black deck.
Sure.
And yeah. I think that just causes them to be pretty popular, on top of them being two of the rock-solid decks, while everything else is very solid or can range a little bit.
That's wild. A year ago reminded me that I got the Facebook memory today about the end of SCG Atlanta last year, which was the first Oko Urza format. It was the first event with Oko and Urza really as a deck for people. And it's crazy to think that's a year ago at the time of this recording. It's kind of wild, actually, to think about.
Yeah, that is crazy.
Yeah, let's move on to Titan decks, because Titan decks are kind of the other thing that's been a big part of the format in the past. And what happened to Amulet, and what's this new green-white Titan deck that I heard about on Up to Date that Will Kruger won't stop talking about?
Amulet's kind of fallen off because there have been a lot.
Will Kruger won't stop talking about.
Amulet's kind of fallen off because there have been a lot of Ether Gusts. A lot of Ether Gusts running around. And Amulet's kind of suffered ever since the Once Upon a Time ban. It basically, Once Upon a Time made the deck almost broken because you just always had Castle, you always had your bounce land, you always had your Dryad or your Titan on time, every time. And now you have to assemble your perfect mix of those pieces without that, and that's really tough. You have to play basically less copies of all the creatures, more copies of the actual lands, so you draw the actual lands in duplicates more, which can be really awkward. It basically, it suffers from a lot of consistency issues, on top of it was the top dog semi-recently, so everyone knows how to beat it still. Nothing's really changed, except that deck got a little bit worse. And then everyone still knows exactly how to beat you if they want to.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
If they want to.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So what is green-white Titan then? What is this? Seems to be the marquee Titan deck these days.
Yeah, so friend of the Up to Date cast, Fran F. Paulus.
I believe that's how you say it, but you're not gonna get me to try to pronounce it.
I literally was on his stream one time as a guest, and he refused to tell me how to pronounce his name.
That's a guess.
Yeah, so I've just had to guess ever since. But he basically, he's the one who pulled Reclaimer flagstones in kind of a Titan shell to the forefront. He did it with Vile, which Zach and I kind of, to humor him, played some leagues with that deck, and we both agreed that Vile was horrible for us, and Reclaimer overperformed. The card seemed insane. So we started working on Reclaimer Flagstone's Titan decks that were much more akin to the kind of Titan field decks of the Once Upon a Time decks, right? They were just ramp decks that just had Titan and Field of the Dead. And now with Dryad, you have the Valakut package. And Reclaimer is, with Flagstones, is your best accelerant early in the game, and is kind of a late game engine where you can make a bunch of extra zombies with it. You can have it finds your Valakuts or your fields. It almost operates as a mini Titan. And then it also, like a lot of times people have Ashiok or Planeswalkers against you post board, right? It's just a 3/4 for one. It's just Wild Nacatl still. It still just pressures Planeswalkers really well. And so we had started working on this deck. And then we didn't really continue on it because that's just not really who we are. We're very much more Omnath Uro players. And X-Whale and Dom Harvey really took it from there. Will Kruger and Dom Harvey. And they're the ones who kind of continue to work on the Arcus Box head-to-head event we did recently. I chose to play this deck. I thought it was pretty well positioned. I ended up losing to actually the Felidar cat deck, which I like to make fun of. But yeah, I think the deck is great. It's really good against the Omnath decks. It's solid, like rock solid against the red-black prowess deck. You have 4 Path Exiles. You can play, I mean, I played the full 4 Celestial Purges because it also hits Ashiok post board against the blue decks. Yeah, I think the deck's very good.
Awesome. All right, well, that's encouraging to hear. Last deck I kind of want to talk about on Modern. This deck really took it by storm this last weekend when it came to events, and that's Heliod Combo. Nothing too new it looked like when I looked through the deck. What do you think about Heliod Combo in the metagame? It seems to be the hotness, at least for this last weekend.
I have very few kind things to say about this deck.
You're allowed to be negative on this show. It's okay.
Okay. I could not ever...
To be the hotness, at least for this last weekend.
I have very few kind things to say about this deck.
You're allowed to be negative on this show. It's okay.
Okay. I could not ever bring myself to play a deck like this in a paper event where Infinite Life might actually win you some games. But on Magic Online, where you have to actually... You can still just lose after gaining your, in quotes, infinite life. Like, I've seen people go to 400 against the Omnath decks and just die because Field of the Dead can make 600 power no problem in a reasonable amount of time. It's so silly to me that you would, like, choose to do that to yourself, because you have to click all those times to get yourself to 400 in the first place. I've never been a big supporter of these decks. Especially, I was even more critical back before when we had the whole Urza Thopter Sword people, when Lattice was still legal, people would play this deck, and who cares if you have infinite life? We all have infinite combos that actually kill you. It's so silly to me. Now it's a little bit better. I think it's still weird because you're trying to gain infinite life against the premier aggressive deck in the format, but they're a Thoughtseize all removal spell deck, which I don't know.
You just have no faith in Giver of Runes in the top of your deck. That's all I'm hearing. I had the utmost faith that Giver of Runes is going to need the only kill spell.
I did when Once Upon a Time was legal. I like to play a lot of the Devoted Druid deck. Sure. I'm a big fan of Devoted Druid combo because it kills your opponent. Infinite life ain't it, fam.
That's fair. That's fair. I think there's a lot of
it used to be.
I assume that deck is unbeatable because it won, and if that's the case, it can't have any flaws since it has all those flaws you talked about, and that everyone playing that tournament that they played against had a lot of love for the game and thought, I'm gonna concede 400 life. I get it. I would have normally lost in real life, which respect for. But yeah, I'm not a huge fan of that deck or that style of deck, even when it comes to real life in most metagames. I just not a lot of agency and not a lot of control even over your own deck, which is surprising without Once Upon a Time. So
yeah, don't get me wrong. If my opponent gains 400 life and I can still kill them, I'm still conceding.
Sure,
that ain't worth it for me.
Yeah, in most situations, it's just concede you're at a loss, whatever it's testing. Who cares, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, I think that kind of does it for Modern. Is there anything that you would want to definitely talk about with Modern that maybe we missed, or any thoughts to wrap us up here?
I mean, it's Modern. We could talk about 20 more decks that are playable, right? I could do this all day. I think that is a pretty good spot for everyone who's listening. I mean, anyone who's listening, if you want to hear about another Modern deck or my thoughts about a Modern deck, you can at me on Twitter at Harlan Firer if you really want to. About a Modern deck, you can at me on Twitter at Harlan Firer if you really want to. I think I'm good for right now.
Awesome. Well, I thought of one while you're gone. It feels like it'd be a mistake if I didn't get the thumbs up, thumbs down. You don't have to do anything else. Urza. It's still in Modern. One of the best cards ever. Well known for.
Don't remind me how bad Urza is, please.
That's a thumbs down. All right, we're going to keep moving on. Well, Harlan, thank you so much for joining us on this week's episode. If someone wanted to find you or maybe the podcast once again, give yourself a shout out here before we head out the door.
Yeah, so myself is at Harlan Firer, just my name on Twitter. The podcast is at up2 date MTG at Twitter. You can also check out Zach at A22EN at Twitter. And yeah, with that, you're up to date.
Perfect. Well, thank you all so much for hanging out with us, and we'll see y'all next week for another episode of Constructed Criticism.